It is some time past dawn on April 9th, 1892, and Nate Champion is alone. His friend Nick Ray is on the floor beside him, shot through the body, bleeding out on the rough planks of a one-room cabin in Johnson County, Wyoming. Outside, 50 armed men have the cabin surrounded. They are in the stable. They are behind the woodpile. They are in the brush along the Powder River. And every one of them is here to kill Nate Champion. Nate is 34 years old, a cattle rancher, a Texan by birth, a cowboy by trade. He owns nearly 200 head of cattle and 8 horses he just finished paying off. He is not a general. He is not a soldier. He is one man with a Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver, and a door he has barricaded shut with whatever he can find. What happens next will last 12 hours. 12 hours of one man, alone in a burning cabin, holding off an army of 50. By the time it ends, Nate Champion will have killed more of them than they ever expected. And he will write his own death as it happens. When they finally brought him down, one account says he was hit by 28 bullets. Another says 10. The numbers do not agree. What everyone agrees on is this: Nate Champion did not die hiding. He came out of that cabin with a gun in each hand. But the strangest part, while the bullets tore through the walls around him, Nate pulled out a lead pencil and a small journal, and he started writing. He wrote to his friends. He wrote about the gunfire. He wrote his own goodbye. And when the killers found his body, they tore pages out of that journal. What were they so desperate to hide? This is the story of the real death of Nate Champion, and what actually happened inside that cabin is something most people have never heard. If you are fascinated by the untold stories of the Old West, the ones they left out of the history books, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss. 1. Now, let me take you back to Wyoming. Back to the years before that cabin. Back to the reason 50 men wanted one cowboy dead. Nate Champion was born on September 29th, 1857, near Round Rock, Texas, the same rough stretch of central Texas hill country that produced gunslingers, cattle drives, and men who learned to ride before they could read. Nate was not a gunslinger. He was a working cowboy, and by all accounts, one of the best in the territory. He rode hard, worked honest, and by his early 30s he had done what most cowboys only dreamed about. He had saved enough money to buy his own herd. Nearly 200 cattle, 8 pack horses, every one of them paid for in full. A small ranch in Johnson County, Wyoming, along the Powder River. He was not rich, but he was building something, and it belonged to him. But in Johnson County in the early 1890s, building something small made you a target. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, the WSGA, was a coalition of the richest and most powerful cattlemen in the territory. These were men who ran ranches that stretched across entire horizons, men whose herds numbered in the tens of thousands, men who had lunch with the territorial governor and expected the laws of Wyoming to bend in their direction. And they had decided that the small ranchers, the homesteaders, the men like Nate who were carving out pieces of the open range, were thieves. Not because they had proof, because small ranchers were competition, and competition in the minds of men who believed they owned the grass itself had to be eliminated. The WSGA did not file lawsuits. They did not petition the courts. They drew up a death list, names of men they wanted killed, and at the top of that list sat 2 names, Nate Champion and Nick Ray. The justification was rustling, cattle theft. The truth was something uglier. Nate represented everything the cattle barons feared, a small man succeeding on land they considered theirs, a cowboy who did not need them, did not answer to them, did not depend on their goodwill for his livelihood. They called him a rustler. They called him the leader of a rival stock association. Neither accusation was true. Not every man in the WSGA outfit was a millionaire rancher nursing a grudge. Many of the 50 who would ride toward the KC ranch that April were hired guns, Texas stock detectives, former lawmen, men who took the work because it paid, and because someone in a suit told them they would be on the right side of the law. Some had families back in Cheyenne. Others were drifters who signed on for wages and the promise that the territorial governor had their backs. They were told they were going to clean out rustlers. They were told these were bad men. Some of them probably believed it. A paycheck and a righteous story can make a man do terrible things without ever feeling like a villain. But here is the thing that should bother you. The rival stock association that the WSGA claimed Nate led. He did not lead it. He had been nominated, yes. In 1891, small ranchers in Johnson County organized a competing roundup association, a direct challenge to the WSGA monopoly. Somebody put Nate Champion's name forward to head it. It was not his idea. He was not campaigning for the job. He did not even attend the meeting where they nominated him. He declined the position outright. It did not matter. His name was attached to the movement. And on the night of April 8, 1892, 50 of their men boarded a special train heading north from Cheyenne, carrying enough guns and ammunition to start a small war. That is exactly what they intended to do. The column that rode toward the KC Ranch on the morning of April 9th was not a posse. It was not a militia acting under any legal authority. It was a private army. Approximately 50 men, wealthy cattlemen from Cheyenne, riding alongside hired Texas gunfighters, former sheriffs turned stock detectives, and professional enforcers paid to kill. They traveled with wagons loaded with supplies, ammunition, bedrolls, and food for days in the field. They had a schedule. The KC Ranch, where Nate Champion and Nick Ray were wintering, was the first stop. There were more names on the list. They planned to move fast, strike hard, and finish the job before anyone in Buffalo could organize a response. The KC Ranch sat in open terrain along the Powder River, a one-room log cabin with a stable about 75 yards to the south, and a shallow gulch running roughly 100 yards to the north. The river itself was close enough to walk to for water. It was cattle country, flat, wide, exposed. For a man defending a cabin, the geography was a nightmare. There was no cover between the cabin and any direction an attacker might come from. The stable gave the invaders a perfect firing position, close enough to put accurate rifle fire into every wall and window of the building. Think about the math for a moment. 50 armed men, professional killers, wagons full of ammunition. Against 4 men in a one-room cabin, 2 of whom were unarmed trappers just passing through. The WSGA did not come to arrest Nate Champion. They did not come to negotiate. They came with enough firepower to wipe a small town off the map, and they pointed it at a single log building with a dirt floor. The irony that haunts this story is the reason Nate Champion was at the top of that list. In 1891, small ranchers in Johnson County had organized a competing roundup association, a direct challenge to the WSGA's monopoly on when and how cattle were gathered. Someone nominated Nate Champion to lead it. It was not his idea. He was not campaigning. He did not even show up to the meeting. He declined the nomination outright. But the damage was done. His name was attached to the movement, and in the boardrooms of Cheyenne, where cattle barons drew their lists over whiskey and cigars, that was enough, a name on a piece of paper, a nomination he never accepted. That was the reason for the 50 men in the mud outside his cabin. More than a century later, Nate's great-great-great-nephew, Dale Champion, put it plainly. By their choosing Nate, they signed his death warrant. He was not wrong. The nomination Nate never accepted, for a position he never held, in an organization he never led, that was the reason 50 men were lying in the cold Wyoming mud outside his cabin on April 9, 1890. 2. Nate was not alone at KC that winter. Nick Ray was with him, another small rancher, a cowboy from Johnson County's independent stock circles, who had been running cattle and participating in the competing roundups that drove the WSGA to fury. Ray's name sat right next to Nate's on the death list. He was a working man, a partner, the kind of quiet, steady presence that does not make it into legends because legends need a single hero. He would be the first to die that morning. He would not be the last. Leading the kill team was Frank Canton. He was about 44 years old in 1892, born in Texas, raised on the same rough frontier as the men he had been hired to eliminate. Canton had worn a badge. He had served as sheriff of Johnson County itself before the cattle barons bought his loyalty and turned him into their chief enforcer. He was a lawman who became a gunfighter, a sheriff who became an assassin, and on April 9th, he would personally oversee the siege, help orchestrate the fire that drove Nate out, and after Nate was dead, Canton walked to the body, reached down, and pulled Nate's .45 caliber Colt revolver from his waistband, a souvenir, taken from a man he had helped murder. A former sheriff of the very county where Nate Champion lived, now leading a private death squad to kill a man in that same county. If that does not tell you everything about how power worked in Wyoming Territory in 1892, nothing will. On the evening of April 8, 1892, the KC Ranch cabin held 4 men, Nate Champion and Nick Ray, partners, small ranchers bedding down for the night after a day of work, and 2 trappers, nameless in every surviving account, transient men who had knocked on the door looking for shelter on a raw, rainy night and been invited in the way frontier hospitality demanded. 4 men in a one-room cabin. None of them knew that a private army was riding north through the darkness toward them. But here is the choice that defines this story, and it had not happened yet. It would come in the morning, in the seconds after the first gunshot. When Nick Ray went down in the doorway, hit by a fusillade from the stable, Nate Champion had a choice. The cabin walls were his only protection. Ray was outside or half outside, crumpling in the open. 50 rifles were trained on that door. Every instinct a man has says, stay inside, bar the door, survive. You cannot save a man in the open when 50 guns are pointed at the exit. Every rational calculation leads to the same answer. Let him fall. Nate did not stay inside. He grabbed his Winchester, bolted through the doorway into the open, seized Nick Ray by the collar, and dragged his dying friend back inside, firing at the stable as he went. It was not a tactical decision. It was a human one. And it was the decision that began the 12-hour siege that would make Nate Champion a legend. Whether this moment unfolded in precisely these seconds, in this exact sequence, historians have debated. The emotional truth of it has never been in question. Nate went into the gunfire, he brought his friend inside, and then he shut the door on 50 men and fought them alone. The morning of April 9, 1892, started in darkness and rain. By sundown, the KC Ranch would be ashes. 2 men would be dead, and the most powerful men in Wyoming would realize they had made a terrible mistake. It all began with the sound of footsteps walking toward the river. The 50 men of the WSGA invasion force reached the KC Ranch in the last hours of darkness on April 9th. The morning was raw, cold rain falling through poor visibility, the kind of Wyoming spring that feels more like late winter. They spread out in silence. Some took positions in the stable, 75 yards south of the cabin. Others moved into the brush along the Powder River. A few crouched behind the woodpile. Within minutes, the cabin was encircled. Every window, every door, every possible exit covered by rifle barrels. Inside, 4 men slept. The invaders settled in to wait for first light and the first movement from within. The first movement came just after dawn. The 2 trappers, men with no stake in the cattle war, no names worth recording in history, just travelers who had asked for a warm floor for the night, stepped out of the cabin and walked toward the Powder River to fetch water. 75 yards, a short walk on any other morning. They did not make it. Invaders materialized from the brush and grabbed them before they could shout a warning. No shots fired. No resistance. The trappers were dragged away and held under guard. They were not the targets. They were simply in the wrong cabin on the wrong morning, and the only crime they committed was walking toward a river at dawn. Minutes later, Nick Ray appeared in the cabin doorway. Maybe he was looking for the trappers who had not come back. Maybe he was checking the weather. The accounts do not say what he was thinking, only what happened. A volley of rifle fire erupted from the stable 75 yards away. Multiple shooters. The distance was close enough to see his face. Ray was hit before he could react, bullets tearing into his body. He staggered, crumpled against the doorframe, half inside, half outside. Mortally wounded. Still breathing, but not for long. And from inside the cabin, Nate Champion heard every shot. He had been in bed moments earlier. Now his partner was dying in the doorway, and the 50 men outside had just announced exactly what this morning was going to be. This is the moment that separates Nate Champion from every other man in this story. What he did next, in the next 5 seconds, is the reason we are still talking about him 130 years later, because the safe choice, the survival choice was obvious. Stay behind the walls. Let Ray fall. You cannot save a man in the open when 50 rifles are pointed at the door. Every calculation says, stay inside. Nate Champion did not calculate. Nate Champion grabbed his Winchester rifle and went through that door. Out into the open. Into the kill zone. He fired at the stable as he moved, fast, controlled shots from a man who had been handling rifles since he was old enough to sit a horse in Texas. He reached Nick Ray, seized him by the collar, and hauled him backward through the doorway. Ray was heavy. Dead weight, or close to it. Bullets struck the doorframe, the cabin wall, the ground around his boots. But Nate got him inside. He slammed the door, he barricaded it with anything he could find, furniture, gear, whatever the one-room cabin held, and then he did the only thing left to do. He checked his ammunition. And he waited. Outside, the invaders regrouped. This was not how it was supposed to go. The plan was a quick strike, surround the cabin, eliminate the targets at first opportunity, move on to the next names on the death list. They had a schedule. There were more men to kill in Johnson County before word spread, but Nate Champion was inside that cabin, with a Winchester and clear sightlines from every window. He could cover all 4 walls from the center of the room, and he was a dead shot. The quick strike was over. The siege had begun, and it would not end for 12 hours. 12 hours. Let that number settle. The average Hollywood gunfight lasts about 90 seconds. The shootout at the OK Corral lasted 30 seconds. Nate Champion held off 50 professional killers from a one-room cabin for 12 hours, with 1 rifle, 1 pistol, and a dying man on the floor beside him. The invaders poured fire into the cabin. Bullets punched through the log walls, splintered the door, shattered what remained of the windows. From inside, Nate returned fire with devastating accuracy. He moved between windows. He picked his shots. And he killed. Over the course of the morning, at least 4 of the 50 invaders outside fell to Nate's Winchester, dropped in the stable, behind the woodpile in the brush along the river. Several more were wounded badly enough to be dragged back by their companions. One man, alone, was inflicting casualties on a small army. The invaders who had ridden north so confidently from Cheyenne were now pinned down by their own target. Inside the cabin, Nick Ray's breathing grew shallow and then stopped. The exact hour is not recorded, but sometime in the morning hours, while Nate fired and reloaded and fired again, his partner, the man he had dragged through gunfire, died on the cabin floor beside him. Nate was now truly alone. 4 walls, 50 men outside, a dead friend beside him, and a small journal in his pocket that he would soon begin to fill with the most remarkable document in frontier history. What Nate Champion did next was not what anyone expected. He did not try to escape. He did not even shout for terms. He sat down. He pulled out a lead pencil, and in the middle of a firefight, with bullets tearing through the walls around him, he started writing. There is no record of exactly when Nate Champion first put pencil to paper, but at some point during the siege, with Nick Ray dead on the floor, with bullet holes letting grey daylight through the cabin walls in narrow shafts, with the crack of rifle fire coming in unpredictable bursts from every direction, Nate opened a small journal and began to write. In lead pencil, calmly, as though he were keeping notes on the weather or tallying cattle after a roundup. The entries he wrote over the next several hours would become the most extraordinary real-time death chronicle in the history of the American West. He wrote to his friends, not to a governor, not to a newspaper, to the boys, the men he rode with, drank with, worked cattle beside in the open country along the Powder River. He noted the gunfire. He noted who he thought was outside. He described the bullets coming through the walls. He described watching, waiting, firing back. He wrote the way a man speaks when he knows he is talking to people who will understand without explanation. There was no self-pity in those pencil marks, no pleading, no cursing the men outside, just a cowboy telling his friends what was happening to him while it happened. And then he wrote the line that cracks the heart open. Sometime during those hours alone, with his partner's body growing cold on the floor beside him, Nate Champion pressed his pencil to paper and wrote, "Boys, I feel pretty lonesome just now. I wish there was someone here with me so we could watch all sides at once. That is not the voice of a man giving up. It is the voice of a man who is still fighting, still thinking tactically, still wishing for a partner to cover the windows he cannot watch while he reloads." The loneliness in that sentence is not defeat. It is the sound of a man who knows he is going to die and is writing through it anyway. Stop and think about what you are hearing. This is not a letter written after the fact. This is not a memoir composed in safety. Nate Champion was writing his journal in real time, under fire while bullets punched through the walls around him. He was documenting his own murder as it happened. There is nothing else like it in frontier history. Nothing. As the hours ground on, the rhythm of the siege became almost perverse in its regularity. Bursts of gunfire, silence, more gunfire. Nate answering with his Winchester when he had a target, moving from window to window in the one-room cabin, stepping over Ray's body each time. The invaders tried different angles. They repositioned, they probed, and each time Nate drove them back. One man, the same man they had labeled a rustler and a troublemaker. The man who had declined a nomination he never sought. He was costing them time, men, and the initiative, and they could not get inside that cabin. By mid-morning, the invasion was already behind schedule. The plan had called for a swift killing, in and out, move on to the next targets before the town of Buffalo got word and organized resistance. But Nate Champion had upended everything. The 50 men surrounding the cabin had expected to kill a sleeping rancher. Instead, they had a combat veteran of the range pinning them down with accurate fire, killing their men and showing no sign of surrender or despair. They could not advance on the cabin without crossing open ground in his sightlines. They could not wait forever. Every hour increased the chance that a rider from a neighboring ranch had seen the commotion, heard the gunfire, and was already galloping toward Buffalo to raise the alarm. The toll on the invaders climbed through the morning. At least 4 men lay dead from Nate's fire, dropped at the stable, in the brush behind cover that was not thick enough to stop a Winchester round at 75 yards. Several more were wounded, dragged back by their companions to be patched up behind the wagons. One man in a cabin was inflicting the kind of casualties that 50 men were supposed to inflict on him. The mathematics of the siege had inverted. The invaders were losing. 4 dead, several wounded. From one man with a lever-action rifle inside a cabin the size of a modern living room, the hired gunfighters from Texas, professionals who had been paid to do exactly this kind of work, were being outfought by a cowboy who had been asleep 3 hours earlier. Whatever they were paying Frank Canton, it was not enough. Between shots, Nate continued his journal entries. The pencil marks grew tighter, more urgent as the hours passed. He noted the movements outside. He tracked the gunfire patterns. He recorded the passing hours like a man keeping a log at sea in a storm, methodical, factual, edged with the quiet awareness that the storm was not going to break. The journal was becoming something more than a record. It was becoming a testament, a man's proof that he had been here, that he had fought, that he had not run, that when they came for him, he had made them pay for every hour. Sometime around midday, the invaders held a conference. They had spent the entire morning failing to kill one man. Their schedule was in ruins. More targets waited in Johnson County, but every hour spent at KC Ranch was an hour that let the alarm spread northward to Buffalo, where Sheriff Red Angus could raise a posse. They needed a solution, and they needed it now. Someone, the accounts point to Canton and the senior cattlemen, proposed fire. If they could not shoot Nate Champion out of his cabin, they would burn him out. It was the decision that ended the siege. About 100 yards from the cabin, the invaders found what they needed: a ranch wagon, loose hay, and pine poles stacked for fencing. They loaded the wagon with hay and the dry pine, creating a massive rolling fire starter. The plan was crude but effective: set the wagon ablaze, push it across the open ground, and jam it against the cabin wall beneath one of the windows. The dry logs of the cabin would catch within minutes. The man inside would have two choices: burn to death or come out into the open. Either way, the siege would be over. They soaked the hay, they lit it, and they started pushing. 50 men, professional killers, cattlemen, former sheriffs. And after an entire morning of trying, their final strategy against one cowboy was to set his house on fire. That is what Nate Champion had reduced them to. Not a tactical maneuver, not a flanking assault. Arson, because nothing else had worked. The blazing wagon struck the cabin wall, and the effect was immediate. Dry pine and old timber, the cabin may as well have been built from kindling. Flames crawled up the logs, caught the roof, and within minutes smoke was billowing from every window and crack in the walls. Inside, the temperature soared. The smoke thickened until breathing became impossible. The light shifted from gray to orange. Everything Nate Champion could see was fire. Everything he could smell was burning wood, and the sharp bite of smoke clawing into his lungs. The cabin was going to collapse around him. He had minutes, maybe less, and Nate Champion sat down one last time and wrote. The flames were climbing the walls. Smoke choked the air. Sparks fell from the ceiling onto the pages in his hand. And this man, this 34-year-old cowboy from Round Rock, Texas, who had never asked to lead anything, who had declined the nomination that put him on the death list, who had spent 12 hours fighting 50 men alone, pressed his pencil to the paper and wrote his last words. The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again. He signed it, Nate Champion. Then he closed the journal and put it in his pocket. Not on the table, not on the floor where it would burn. In his pocket, where they would find it on his body. He wanted those words to survive him. And they did. Nate stood. He picked up his Winchester rifle and held it in his right hand. He drew his Colt .45 revolver and gripped it in his left. 2 guns. One door, the back door, the side the invaders might not have fully covered. He knew what was waiting outside. He knew 50 rifles would turn on him the moment he cleared the smoke. It did not matter. Nate Champion was going out, and he was going out fighting. Nate Champion burst through the back door of the burning cabin at a run. The smoke trailed behind him like a cloak. Winchester in his right hand, Colt in his left. He did not raise his hands. He did not call for terms. He ran hard, fast, toward the gulch 100 yards north, firing as he went. After 12 hours pinned inside 4 walls, after watching his friend die, after writing his own goodbye while the ceiling burned above him, he came out shooting. It was the last thing the invaders expected, and it was the only thing Nate Champion was ever going to do. The rifles opened up from multiple positions simultaneously. The accounts diverge on what happened next. One version says 28 bullets struck Nate's body. Another says 10 rounds, and he was dead before he hit the ground. The difference may be the difference between the first volley and what followed, between the shots that killed him and the shots fired into a man already falling. What no account disputes is this: Nate Champion did not make it to the gulch. He fell 100 yards from the burning cabin, his Winchester still in his hand, his Colt still in his grip, his journal still in his pocket. 28 bullets. or 10. It does not matter. What matters is what happened in the 12 hours before those bullets hit. 1 man, 1 cabin, 50 attackers, 4 invaders dead, several more wounded. A journal written under fire that would become the most famous frontier document in Wyoming history. That is not just a bullet. That is a man who fought a small war by himself and lost only because they burned his fort down around him. Nate's body lay in the gulch, twisted where he fell. Not in the cabin ruins, as some first reports claimed, but 100 yards away, in the open, facing the direction he had been running. He had almost made it to cover. Almost. The burning cabin sent a column of black smoke into the gray Wyoming sky behind him. The sound of gunfire echoed off the empty rangeland and faded into nothing. The siege of the KC ranch was over. It had lasted 12 hours. What the invaders did next reveals everything about what kind of men they were. They did not bury Nate Champion. They did not leave his body with any dignity. They walked to the man they had just killed, the man who had held them off for half a day, who had killed 4 of their own, who had outfought them so thoroughly they had resorted to arson. And they turned his death into a message. The 50 men gathered around Nate Champion's body in the gulch. The cabin burned behind them, its roof collapsing inward, sending sparks upward into the rain. What they found on Nate's body should have terrified them. The journal, the lead-pencil diary he had written throughout the siege, was in his pocket, intact. They opened it, they read it, and they realized that Nate Champion had named them. He had recorded who was outside, what he saw, what he heard. The diary was a witness statement written by a dead man, so they did what powerful men always do when evidence threatens them. They tore pages out. Carefully, deliberately, they removed the entries that named specific invaders. Then they closed it and put it back in his pocket. They were not finished. Someone produced a piece of paper and scrawled 2 words, "Cattle thieves beware." They pinned it to Nate Champion's bullet-riddled chest. A warning, a justification, a lie dressed up as a message. The man they had labeled a cattle thief owned nearly 200 head of cattle, all legally purchased. He had 8 pack horses, paid for in full. He had declined the position they accused him of holding. The note on his chest was not a verdict. It was propaganda pinned to a dead man. Frank Canton walked to the body and reached down. He pulled Nate Champion's Colt .45 revolver from his waistband and kept it. A trophy. The former sheriff of Johnson County, the man who had sworn an oath to protect the people of this land, now pocketed the weapon of the man he had helped murder on that same land. Canton would face a coroner's jury. He would be named as a killer. He would never spend a single day in prison for it. They pinned a note calling him a cattle thief to the chest of a man who owned 200 head of cattle. They tore the evidence out of his diary, and the man who led the attack took his gun as a souvenir. This is not justice. This is not even vigilantism. This is assassination dressed up in a cattleman's vest. That evening, the invaders ate supper beside their wagons within sight of the smoldering cabin. They had spent an entire day, a full 12 hours, on a single target. Their schedule was destroyed. The death list had dozens of names, and they had only reached 2. They left the KC ranch around 9 that night, heading toward the town of Buffalo to continue their campaign. They left orders for their supply teams to follow the next morning. Those teams never made it. Sheriff Red Angus of Johnson County intercepted them on the road. Word had reached Buffalo. The alarm that Nate Champion's 12-hour stand had brought was already spreading across the county like wildfire. Nate's death did not end the killing. His brother, Dudley Champion, described in accounts as more boy than man, was waylaid and shot later in 1892 by Mike Chauncey, one of the WSGA enforcers. Chauncey feared what Dudley might do, what he might know, what the family name itself represented in Johnson County after the siege. Dudley survived the shooting, but the message was clear. The cattle barons would not stop at Nate. The name Champion itself was a target. Even in death, Nate's stand at the KC Ranch had made his family dangerous to the men who believed they owned Wyoming. On April 15, 1892, nearly a week after the siege, the people of Buffalo buried Nate Champion and Nick Ray, 6 days between murder and burial. The funerals drew crowds. The small ranchers, the homesteaders, the cowboys who had worked alongside these men came to say goodbye and to demand answers. The next day, April 16th, a coroner's jury convened and delivered its verdict. The deaths of Nate Champion and Nick Ray were premeditated murder. The jury named Frank Canton and several other invaders as the killers. It was a clear, unambiguous legal finding, and it meant nothing. The WSGA had connections that ran all the way to the territorial governor and the President of the United States. The invaders were taken into federal custody, not as punishment, but as protection. The invaders themselves tasted briefly what Nate had experienced. After leaving KC Ranch, they were tracked and besieged by Sheriff Angus's posse at the TA Ranch on Crazy Woman Creek, surrounded for 2 days by the very settlers they had come to terrorize. One man escaped and reached acting Governor Amos W. Barber, who telegraphed President Benjamin Harrison. Federal cavalry rode in and took the invaders into custody, not to stand trial, not to face the murder charges from the coroner's jury, to be escorted to safety. 50 men who had committed premeditated murder walked free because they were rich enough and connected enough to have the United States Army come and save them from the consequences of what they had done. Nate Champion died in a gulch in Johnson County, Wyoming, on April 9, 1892. He was 34 years old. He had fought 50 men for 12 hours, killed at least 4 of them, and written his own obituary in lead pencil while his cabin burned around him. But the battle over who Nate Champion really was, that fight lasted another century. In the decades after the Johnson County War, Nate Champion became a folk hero. His journal, even with the missing pages, was published and republished. His 12-hour stand against 50 men entered the mythology of the American West alongside the Alamo and the gunfight at the OK Corral. Wyoming inducted him into its Cowboy Hall of Fame. The KC Ranch site became a landmark, and the story, as stories do, simplified. Nate Champion became the lone cowboy who died fighting. The cattle barons became faceless villains. The complications, the class warfare, the political corruption, the competing economic systems that drove small ranchers and large operations into open conflict, all of it flattened into a shootout. The real story is both simpler and more disturbing than the legend. Here is what most people get wrong about Nate Champion's death. They imagine a man gunned down, a quick killing, a bullet in the back, the kind of murder the frontier produced by the hundreds. The title says it. It was not just a bullet. But even people who know the basic story miss the full scope. Nate Champion killed at least 4 of the men who came to kill him. He wounded several more. He held off a private army for 12 hours. He wrote a real-time account of his own siege and put it in his pocket so it would survive him. The invaders did not overpower him. They could not. They had to burn his cabin to the ground to force him into the open, and even then he came out with a gun in each hand. The WSGA wanted to erase Nate Champion. They pinned a note to his chest. They tore pages from his diary. They used their connections to avoid prosecution, and it backfired completely. Nate Champion's journal, the document they mutilated, became the most damning piece of evidence against them. The words they could not bring themselves to destroy told the story they spent decades trying to suppress. The pages they left behind were enough. More than enough. No one was ever convicted for the murders of Nate Champion and Nick Ray. The coroner's jury declared it premeditated murder and named the killers. The legal system shrugged. The invaders had the governor. They had the president. They had the kind of money that makes evidence disappear and witnesses go quiet. Frank Canton continued working as a stock detective for years afterward. The cattle barons kept their ranches, and the small ranchers of Johnson County learned the lesson that power teaches again and again. Being right does not mean being safe. The verdict that named the killers changed nothing. Nothing except the historical record. Go back to that cabin. It is past dawn on April 9th, 1892. Nate Champion is 34 years old. His friend is dying on the floor. 50 men surround the walls. And this man, this Texas cowboy who owned 200 head of cattle and 8 horses and wanted nothing more than to ranch his own land, pulls out a pencil and writes, "Boys, I feel pretty lonesome just now." He fought for 12 hours. He killed 4 of them. He wrote his own goodbye while the walls burned. And then he came out with a gun in each hand. That is the real death of Nate Champion. And it was not just a bullet. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories like this. History deserves to be told right.